You're standing in a corridor that shouldn't exist. The walls are papered in silk, French, expensive, the kind that costs more per yard than a working family earns in a year. But the corridor itself is only 3 feet wide. Your shoulders nearly touch both sides. The ceiling presses down, barely 7 feet high, forcing you to move with your head slightly bowed. This is not a servant's passage, though it resembles one. Those are elsewhere, mapped and documented. This corridor appears on no blueprint filed with the city. No architectural drawing acknowledges its presence. Yet, here it is, running through the walls of one of Fifth Avenue's grandest mansions, connecting rooms that should not need connecting. And there are holes in the walls, small, carefully positioned at eye level, each one offering a view into a different room, the library, the drawing room, the private chambers. Someone designed these viewing points deliberately. Someone intended to watch, unseen. What if I told you that beneath the marble and mahogany of Victorian high society, there existed an architecture of secrets? That the mansions we remember for their beauty contained hidden geometries designed for purposes their owners never publicly acknowledged? That the same families who commissioned portraits celebrating their virtue also commissioned spaces specifically built for concealment, observation, and control? You think the Victorian era's great homes were simply expressions of wealth and taste? You think their elaborate designs served aesthetic purposes, demonstrating sophistication, displaying cultural refinement, announcing social position? But architecture reveals intention, and when you find corridors that don't appear on official documents, viewing ports hidden in decorative panels, rooms accessible only through concealed doors, and modifications made to buildings in the middle of the night by contractors who left no records, you're not looking at decoration. You're looking at a system. The mansion doesn't just house the family. It enforces a particular order. It creates and maintains specific relationships of power. It makes certain things possible while ensuring others remain invisible. And it does all this through spatial design so carefully calculated that most people who lived in these buildings never understood the full architecture surrounding them. Before we move deeper into these hidden passages, before we open doors that were meant to remain locked, leave a like if you're prepared to see what Victorian wealth actually required to sustain itself. Subscribe because what we're about to uncover has been buried in architectural plans and family papers for over a century. And comment where you're watching from, because once you understand how these systems worked, you'll start recognizing them everywhere. This is not architectural history. This is archaeology of power. The photograph shows the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, taken in 1895. It's a stunning image. The building rises 5 stories, French Renaissance in style, with limestone facades, elaborate carved details, and a roof punctuated by chimneys and dormers. The proportions are perfect, the craftsmanship evident even in a photograph. This is what wealth looked like when it wanted to be seen. But if you count the windows visible on the exterior and compare them to the floor plans filed with New York City, the official architectural drawings that detailed the building's layout, something doesn't match. The exterior shows significantly more window openings than the interior plans account for. Entire sections of the building's envelope contain windows that, according to the filed documents, shouldn't open into actual rooms. They should face solid walls, storage spaces, or structural voids. Yet there the windows are, which means there are spaces inside this mansion that were built but never officially documented. This wasn't unique to the Vanderbilt house. The same pattern appears across dozens of Gilded Age mansions in New York, Newport, and other centers of American wealth. Architectural historian Sarah Bradford Landau noted in her survey of Fifth Avenue residences that approximately 30% of these buildings contained spatial discrepancies between official documentation and actual construction. 30% is not an accident. It's not architectural error. It's systematic concealment. The visible mansion, the one photographed and admired, served specific functions. It displayed wealth, demonstrated taste, provided space for elaborate social rituals that reinforced class position. The entrance hall, with its marble columns, announced you had entered a world of privilege. The grand staircase created theatrical moments of descent. The ballroom accommodated hundreds of guests in a space designed to make luxury feel natural. But these public spaces comprised perhaps half of the building's total square footage. The remainder, servants' quarters, service corridors, kitchens, storage, mechanical systems, existed to make the public spaces function. And beyond even those documented service areas, there were the spaces that appeared on no plans at all. Consider the daily routine in such a house. The family wakes in private chambers on the upper floors. They dress with assistance from personal servants, who entered through doors the family never uses, doors concealed in wall panels or hidden behind furniture. They descend the grand staircase, but they didn't climb those stairs the night before. There are private back stairs connecting family quarters directly to their chambers, bypassing public spaces entirely. Breakfast appears in the morning room as if by magic. The table is already set, food already arranged, the room already warmed. The family never sees the servants who accomplish this, never witnesses the hauling of coal, the carrying of hot water, the coordination required. The servants use different stairs, different corridors, moved through the walls of the house like ghosts. After breakfast, the family disperses, the father to his study or to meetings, the mother to correspondence or social calls, the children to lessons with tutors. Each moves through spaces specifically designed for them, spaces that feel private, comfortable, controlled. But they are not alone in these rooms. They are never alone. In the study's wooden paneling, there's a section that looks like solid wall, but contains a hinged panel. Open it from the other side, from the narrow passage behind the walls, and you find a small opening, perhaps 6 inches square, positioned at exactly the right height to view the entire study. The panel blends perfectly with the wall's pattern when closed. You would never notice it unless you knew it was there. These viewing ports exist throughout the house, not in every room, but strategically positioned. One in the library, another in the morning room, several in the private chambers. Each one carefully concealed on the visible side, each accessible from passages that don't appear on any official plan. Who built them? Who used them? The architectural drawings don't say. The contractors who performed this work left no records. The families who commissioned the houses never discussed them in correspondence that survived. But they exist. You can still find them in the few mansions that haven't been demolished or completely renovated. Small rectangular openings in thick walls, passages barely wide enough for one person, running parallel to public corridors. Hidden doors that open only from one side. The official explanation, when these features are acknowledged at all, involves household management. The owners needed to monitor staff, to ensure work was being performed correctly, to maintain oversight of a complex domestic operation. The viewing ports allowed discreet supervision, but that explanation doesn't account for the specific rooms being observed. Servants' quarters had no such ports. Service corridors, where actual work happened, weren't under this kind of surveillance. The viewing points looked into spaces where the family and their guests spent time. Private rooms, intimate spaces. Someone was watching the watchers. The spatial organization of these mansions created distinct realms that rarely intersected. The family's world, public rooms for entertaining, private chambers for family life. The servants' world, kitchens, sculleries, sleeping quarters, service corridors. And then this third realm. The hidden passages, the concealed doors, the secret geometry that overlaid both other worlds while belonging to neither. Most servants never saw these hidden spaces. They knew about the service corridors they were permitted to use, the narrow stairs connecting floors, the passages behind dining rooms and ballrooms that allowed them to enter and exit without using family spaces. But the secret passages? Those were different, narrower, more concealed, accessible only through specific locked doors. The families themselves didn't discuss them. Emily Vanderbilt Sloane's letters mention the house constantly, decorating decisions, social events, household management, but never these architectural peculiarities. Alva Vanderbilt's famously detailed instructions to servants about movement through the house make no reference to the hidden passages visible in the building's actual structure. This silence is itself evidence. You don't fail to mention something this unusual unless you're deliberately avoiding the subject. And then there are the night modifications. Multiple sources, servants' memoirs, contractors' journals, society letters, reference construction work on these mansions that occurred after the buildings were supposedly complete. Work performed at night. Workers arriving after the family had retired, laboring in specific sections of the house, departing before dawn. What were they building? The modifications weren't cosmetic. Those happened during daylight with the family's knowledge. These were structural changes, new walls going up or coming down, doors being installed in unexpected locations, passages being extended or sealed. One surviving contractor's diary from 1887 mentions discrete alterations to the R. Residents per specifications received separately, payment in cash, no documentation required. The entry appears among routine maintenance records and is never explained. Building modifications normally require permits, inspections, official documentation. Structural changes to a major residential building in Manhattan should generate paperwork. But for these nighttime alterations, nothing was filed. No permits, no inspections, no official record, which means someone paid extra, substantially extra, to ensure the work happened invisibly. The mansion as publicly presented told a story about the family, their wealth, their taste, their position in society. Every detail contributed to this narrative. The imported marble declared sophistication. The art collection demonstrated culture. The ballroom's capacity announced social power, but the hidden architecture told a different story. One about control, surveillance, and the mechanisms required to maintain the public performance. One about what happened in the spaces between the public rooms. One about who was watching whom and why they needed to watch in secret. The families who built these houses understood that maintaining their position required more than wealth. It required information. It required knowing what happened in private spaces. It required the ability to observe without being observed, to move through the house without being tracked, to access any room from unexpected directions. And they built that capacity into the physical structure of their homes, then systematically concealed it from public knowledge. The viewing ports weren't just about watching servants. Servants could be monitored openly. That was accepted practice. The hidden passages weren't just about household efficiency. Service corridors already handled that function. No, these features served different purposes. Purposes important enough to justify substantial expense, complex construction, and elaborate concealment. And this illusion was carefully maintained for a reason. Margaret Sullivan had worked in the Astor Mansion for 3 years before she discovered the door. She was a chambermaid, responsible for cleaning the family's private quarters on the 3rd floor. The work was demanding but followed a rigid pattern. Enter each room through the main door, clean systematically from left to right, exit, move to the next room. The pattern never varied. Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, was adamant about consistency. On this particular morning in February 1891, Margaret knocked over a small table while moving it to dust behind. The table struck the wall with a hollow thud, not the solid sound you'd expect from an exterior wall. She pressed her hand against the wallpaper. Behind the silk covering, something gave slightly. Not like plaster, like wood, like a panel. She found the edge by touch, a seam in the wallpaper, so perfectly matched you'd never see it. And there, concealed in the decorative molding, A small brass catch. She pressed it. A section of wall swung inward, revealing darkness. Margaret stood frozen, staring into a space that shouldn't exist. A passage, barely 3 feet wide, running parallel to the corridor she'd just walked through. No windows. No light except what spilled through the door she'd opened. She started to step inside, then heard footsteps in the main corridor. She pushed the panel closed. The catch clicked. The seam disappeared. By the time Mrs. Fletcher entered the room, Margaret was dusting as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, because now Margaret knew the house contained spaces the servants weren't supposed to see, and if there was one hidden door, there were probably others. She began to notice things. The walls were thicker than they needed to be. Certain sections of corridor had no rooms on the other side, or shouldn't, based on the building's layout. There were sounds sometimes when she worked alone, footsteps that seemed to come from inside the walls, moving parallel to wherever she was. She wasn't the only one who noticed. The other maids whispered about it carefully when the senior servants weren't listening. One girl claimed she'd seen Mrs. Astor's lady's maid emerge from a wall panel in the private apartments. Another said she'd heard voices coming from behind the library's wooden paneling. But no one was in the library at the time. The senior servants, Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Morrison, the butler, never acknowledged these observations. When junior servants asked questions, the response was always the same: focus on your duties. The house's architecture wasn't their concern, but it was someone's concern, because the hidden passages were maintained. Margaret noticed that dust never accumulated in the revealed space behind that panel. Someone used these passages regularly enough to keep them clean. She began experimenting cautiously, testing walls for hollow sounds, looking for catches concealed in molding or furniture. She found 3 more hidden doors in areas she was responsible for cleaning. Each opened into the same narrow passages that ran through the walls. One evening, working late to finish rooms after a large dinner party, she heard footsteps in the passage beyond a panel. Clear, deliberate steps. Someone walking through the walls, while the family and guests were still downstairs. The footsteps stopped, directly on the other side of the panel. Margaret held her breath. She was alone in the room, or should have been. The footsteps resumed, moving away. The next day, Mrs. Fletcher called her into the housekeeper's room. Margaret expected reprimand. Perhaps she'd been seen investigating the panels. But Mrs. Fletcher's expression was carefully neutral. "You've been working hard," she said. "Very thorough in your duties." "Thank you, ma'am." Thorough people sometimes notice things, details, architectural features. Margaret said nothing. "This house is old," Mrs. Fletcher continued, "built in stages. Sometimes builders make choices that seem unusual to those unfamiliar with construction. Hidden passages for wiring, for ventilation. Old buildings are full of such spaces. Nothing concerning, nothing that requires investigation." The message was clear. Stop looking. Stop noticing. Margaret continued her work exactly as before. But now she understood the house differently. It wasn't just a residence, it was a machine, with mechanisms most of its inhabitants never saw. Some servants operated visible parts of the machine, cleaning, cooking, maintaining. Others had access to the hidden mechanisms, the passages, the viewing ports, the secret architecture. And the family? They lived in the space the machine created, possibly unaware of the full extent of the architecture surrounding them. Or possibly very aware, which was a more disturbing thought. The hidden passages connected to other features Margaret only discovered gradually. In one of the secret corridors, she found a small wooden panel that slid aside, revealing a view into the library. You could see the entire room through the opening, the desk, the chairs, the door. Anyone in the library would see only wall, but from the passage, you could watch everything. These viewing ports were positioned strategically, not in servants' areas, not in storage rooms, in spaces where the family and guests spent time, private conversations, personal moments, all potentially observable from these concealed positions. But observed by whom? The senior servants had access. Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Morrison certainly knew about the passages. But did they use them? And were they the only ones? Margaret began to suspect the answer was more complicated. There were nights when she heard movement in the passages after the family had retired. Not the distinctive sounds of servants working. They finished by midnight at the latest. These sounds came later, 2, 3 in the morning. Footsteps. Sometimes voices, too muted to understand, but definitely voices. The official story, that the passages were for building systems or ventilation, made no sense. You don't need 3-foot wide passages for pipes and wires. You don't need viewing ports into occupied rooms. You don't need doors that lock only from the passage side. This was surveillance architecture. Spaces specifically designed to allow observation and movement without detection. And it existed in every major mansion Margaret heard about. Other servants, when they felt safe enough to talk, described similar features in the houses where they worked. Hidden passages, concealed doors, viewing ports and decorative panels, night modifications that changed the building's internal geography. This wasn't one eccentric family's architectural quirk. It was a pattern, a system. The wealthy class that built these mansions shared information. Architects like Richard Morris Hunt designed multiple estates for different families. Contractors who specialized in discrete renovations moved between properties. The hidden architecture spread like a shared language among people who needed this kind of spatial control. But why? What required such elaborate concealment? Margaret never found a complete answer. 6 months after discovering the first hidden door, she was dismissed. No explanation provided. Mrs. Fletcher simply informed her that her services were no longer required. She received 2 weeks' wages and left the same day. She found work in another household, this one less wealthy, without the elaborate architecture. But she never forgot the Astor Mansion's secret passages, never stopped wondering what they were really for. And in the years that followed, as she moved between households and heard other servants' stories, she began to piece together possibilities. The passages allowed families to move through their homes undetected, to observe rooms they supposedly weren't in, to access any space without using main doors or being seen by servants. This provided certain capabilities. You could monitor servants' activities beyond what open supervision allowed. You could observe guests when they thought they were alone. You could access private spaces, including spaces belonging to other family members, without leaving evidence of your presence. The architecture created information asymmetry. Those who knew about the passages could gather knowledge others didn't realize was being gathered. They could be in 2 places at once, officially in one location while actually watching from another. And perhaps most important, they could maintain plausible deniability. If something was observed through these hidden methods, they could claim ignorance. There was no official record of the passages existing. No one could prove they'd been used for surveillance. The mansions created a permanent condition of potential observation without anyone knowing exactly when or whether they were being watched. This uncertainty itself was a form of control. But this suffering was only the surface. The modifications always happened at night. Thomas Brennan worked as a specialist contractor in New York during the 1880s and 90s. His services were expensive and discreet. He didn't advertise. New clients found him through referrals from existing clients. Always wealthy families, always for work, they didn't want publicly documented. His diary, discovered in an estate sale in 1947, describes the work in careful detail. The entries are matter-of-fact, treating the unusual as routine. May 15, 1888. W residence. Install new passage connecting second-floor family quarters to third floor. Entry through existing closet. Exit through decorative panel in upstairs corridor. Work performed 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Payment in cash, no receipt issued. September 3rd, 1889. V Mansion. modify existing passage, add viewing port to library, position per client specifications, ensuring line of sight to desk and fireplace. Panel and wallpaper matching completed by dawn. January 12, 1891. A estate. Seal passage to discontinued room. Install new route avoiding modified floor plan. Remove all evidence of original passage. Family unaware of previous configuration. The pattern was consistent. Arrive after the family retired. Work through the night on structural modifications. Leave before servants began morning duties. The work was precise, often requiring advanced carpentry, sometimes including masonry. It wasn't quick or easy. Yet it happened invisibly, incorporated into buildings without official documentation. The diary reveals something else. These weren't isolated jobs. Brennan returned to the same properties repeatedly over years, each time making additional modifications. The hidden architecture wasn't static. It evolved, expanding into new areas of the house, connecting previously separate spaces, adjusting to changing family needs. But what needs? Brennan never recorded that information. His entries focus on technical details, measurements, materials, specific instructions. Why the clients wanted a new passage connecting a study to a bedroom, or why they needed a viewing port repositioned, or why an existing secret door needed to be sealed and a new one created, these questions never appear. One entry is more disturbing than the others. March 7th, 1890. R property. Client requests passage, providing access to all third-floor bedrooms without use of corridor. Entries through closets, exits concealed in wall panels. Particular emphasis on silent operation of mechanisms. Additional payment for expedited work. Access to all bedrooms, without use of corridors. Silent operation. There's no innocent explanation for that specification. You don't need secret silent access to bedrooms for household management. This was about entering private spaces without the occupant's knowledge. The diary doesn't identify clients by full name, just initials. But cross-referencing dates, locations, and architectural details, researchers have matched many entries to specific Fifth Avenue mansions. The R property was almost certainly the Rhinelander residence at 867 Fifth Avenue. The V mansion was one of the Vanderbilt houses, either 640 or 660 Fifth Avenue. These weren't marginal buildings owned by eccentric individuals. These were prominent residences, occupied by families at the center of New York society, and they were systematically installing or modifying secret passages that allowed them to move through their homes and access rooms, including bedrooms, without detection. Other evidence supports this. Henry James, visiting various society homes in the 1880s, wrote a peculiar passage in a letter to his brother. The houses here are magnificent, but oddly constructed. One has the persistent sense of being observed, though by whom or from where, I cannot determine. The walls themselves seem equipped with eyes. James was perceptive enough to notice what he couldn't explain. The architecture created an atmosphere of surveillance without revealing its mechanisms. Edith Wharton, who grew up in this world, alluded to it more directly. In The Age of Innocence, she describes old New York houses as containing secret stairs and passages leading to God knows where. Her readers in 1920 would have assumed this was metaphorical. But Wharton lived in these houses. She knew they literally contained such features. The question becomes, what justified the expense and secrecy? Installing these hidden passages required significant cost. Brennan's rates were high, and he wasn't the only contractor performing this work. The modifications were complex, requiring custom carpentry, careful measurements, matching of materials to ensure concealment. For a family to invest this money repeatedly over years, they needed to derive substantial value from the result. What value does secret access to all bedrooms provide? What purpose requires viewing ports into private rooms? Why would you pay premium rates to ensure no documentation exists of these architectural features? The most uncomfortable answer is the one the evidence supports. These capabilities were being used. The passages weren't decorative or speculative. They served purposes important enough to justify continued investment, purposes that required concealment even from servants, purposes never mentioned in any surviving family correspondence. There are hints in unexpected places. Divorce proceedings from this era occasionally reference evidence obtained through unknown means, or testimony about a spouse's private activities that the testifying party shouldn't have been able to observe. In an 1893 divorce case involving a prominent New York family, the wife's attorney introduced detailed information about the husband's activities in his private study, activities witnessed, apparently, though no explanation was provided for how the observation occurred. The husband's attorney objected, questioning how anyone could have seen events in a locked room. The objection was sustained, but the damage had been done. The architectural features would explain it. A viewing port, accessible from a hidden passage, would allow observation of a supposedly private space without the occupant's knowledge. This suggests surveillance between family members, husbands watching wives, parents monitoring adult children, siblings observing each other. The family's private spaces weren't actually private. They were potentially under observation from concealed vantage points. But it went beyond family surveillance. Servants' memoirs occasionally mention irregularities, moments when things occurred that shouldn't have been possible. Caroline Fitzgerald, a lady's maid in Newport during the 1890s, wrote to her sister about an incident where valuable jewelry disappeared from a locked room, then reappeared days later in a different location within the same room. The door had remained locked throughout. No one admitted entering. Fitzgerald concluded someone else had a key. But what if they didn't need a key? What if they could enter through the walls? The same possibility appears in other servants' accounts. Objects moved when rooms were supposedly unoccupied. Sounds in empty spaces. Shadows glimpsed in mirrors. Visible for a moment in reflected wall panels. Most servants dismissed these experiences as imagination or misunderstanding. But taken together, across multiple households and multiple years, they suggest systematic entry into supposedly secure spaces through means the residents didn't know existed. The hidden architecture wasn't just about observation, it enabled physical access. Someone who knew the secret geography could enter any room, retrieve or plant objects, perform actions, and exit without using doors or being seen by normal occupants. This capability has obvious applications, none of them reassuring. You could acquire information about family members, guests, or servants. You could manipulate physical evidence, adding or removing documents, jewelry, personal items. You could create the appearance of events that didn't occur, or conceal events that did. And because the architecture was secret, you could do all of this with plausible deniability. If questioned, you could truthfully state you hadn't entered through the door. The hidden means of access remained unknown. The more you examine the system, the darker its implications become. The great mansions weren't just homes, they were environments of control, where normal assumptions about privacy and security didn't apply. Where walls had eyes and locked doors provided only the illusion of security. The families who commissioned this architecture knew what they were building. They specified the passages, the viewing ports, the silent mechanisms. They paid for concealment, for the destruction of documentation, for contractors who would perform structural modifications invisibly. They built panopticons but disguised as palaces. And once this system began, there was no escape. The blueprints tell you nothing. If you examine the architectural plans filed with New York City for the major Fifth Avenue mansions, you see standard luxury residences, multiple floors, numerous rooms, clear circulation patterns. The drawings are detailed, showing every door, window, and wall. They're also incomplete. Comparison between filed plans and actual construction reveals systematic omissions. Walls are thicker than documented. Spaces exist between rooms that shouldn't contain anything. The square footage calculated from interior dimensions doesn't match the building's external envelope. The discrepancy is consistent across properties. Actual built space exceeds documented space by 20 to 40%. That missing space is the hidden architecture. It appears on no filed plans. It generates no tax assessment. It exists in legal and regulatory limbo, physically real but officially unacknowledged. And it's extensive enough to represent a significant portion of the building's total area. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who designed many of these mansions, created what amounts to dual plans. The official version, filed with the city, showed the respectable house, rooms for family life, servants' quarters, standard amenities. The second version, never filed, showed everything else. No complete dual plans survive. Hunt and his successors were careful about that. But fragmentary evidence exists. A section of unmarked plans found in Hunt's papers after his death shows passages that don't appear in the corresponding official documents. Notes in his hand reference discrete circulation systems and alternative routes per client specification. These references use euphemistic language, but the meaning is clear. Hunt wasn't just designing mansions. He was designing two overlapping structures, one visible, one hidden. And he was doing so systematically, suggesting this wasn't unique client eccentricity, but standard practice for this tier of wealth. The construction contracts reinforce this. They typically include clauses about additional work to be specified separately, and modifications not requiring documentation. These clauses create legal space for work that won't appear in official records. Payment records show why. The documented portions of construction, the visible mansion, were expensive, but additional cash payments appear in estate records, roughly 20 to 40% above the documented construction costs. These payments have no official purpose, no invoices, no specifications, just large cash transfers to contractors during the construction period. That money paid for the hidden architecture. It also paid for silence. The contractors who built these features worked under strict confidentiality agreements. Those agreements no longer survive. They weren't meant to, but their effects are visible. Workers who performed this specialized construction rarely discussed it later. The few mentions that exist are oblique, referring to discrete projects or specialty work without details. Thomas Brennan's diary is the most complete documentation, and even that is frustratingly vague about clients and purposes. He describes what he built, not why anyone wanted it built, but the cumulative evidence reveals how the system functioned. First, these mansions contain two separate circulation systems. The visible system, main stairs, corridors, formal entrances, served public functions and official household operations. The hidden system, narrow passages, concealed doors, secret stairs, allowed movement outside normal patterns. The two systems connected at specific points, allowing transfer between them. A door in a closet that opened into a hidden passage. A panel behind a bookcase leading to a secret stair. These connection points were carefully positioned, often in private family spaces where servants rarely entered. Second, the hidden system provided access to key observation points. Viewing ports appeared in walls of private rooms, libraries, studies, bedrooms. Each port was positioned for optimal sight lines, allowing someone in the passage to observe the room's occupants without being visible themselves. These weren't casual peepholes. They were precisely engineered. The viewing angles were calculated. The concealment on the visible side was perfect. Hidden and decorative elements matched to wallpaper patterns positioned in shadows. You could look through them for extended periods without anyone in the room knowing. Third, the system allowed entry to supposedly secure spaces. Locked doors became meaningless if you could access a room through a hidden panel. Bedrooms, studies, private apartments, all potentially accessible via routes the occupants didn't know existed. This wasn't just surveillance, it was complete spatial control. The people who knew about these systems could move through the house freely, while others thought they were elsewhere. They could observe private moments, They could access secured spaces. They could create the appearance of being in one location while actually being in another. This generated enormous informational advantage. You could know things about household members or guests they had no idea you knew. You could overhear private conversations. You could access private documents. You could observe behavior people thought was unobserved. And importantly, you could do all of this deniably. Because the systems were secret, you could always claim you hadn't been present. The very existence of the hidden architecture was unknown to most people in the house, including often some family members. The control extended beyond the household. Prominent guests, politicians, business leaders, foreign dignitaries stayed in these mansions. They assumed their private rooms were private. They conducted confidential conversations, wrote sensitive correspondence, behaved as people do when they believe they're unobserved. But the architecture potentially made all of this observable. A viewing port in the guest bedroom wall, a passage allowing access to the study assigned to visiting politicians. The capability existed to gather intelligence on anyone who stayed in the house. Whether that capability was actively exploited is harder to prove, but the architecture wouldn't have been maintained and expanded unless it provided value. The families invested too much money over too many years for these features to be unused curiosities. Some evidence suggests active use. Divorce proceedings, as mentioned, occasionally referenced private information obtained through unexplained means. Business negotiations sometimes concluded with unexpected knowledge asymmetries, one party knowing details about the other that shouldn't have been available. In 1896, a political scandal erupted when confidential strategy discussions among reform candidates somehow became known to Tammany Hall operatives. The discussions occurred in a private study in a Fifth Avenue mansion. The room was locked. Only the participants were present, but the information leaked anyway. The host mansion belonged to a family with known Tammany connections. An architectural analysis later revealed that study could be observed from a concealed passage. This pattern repeats: important conversations in private spaces, followed by improbable intelligence leaks. The mechanism that enabled the leaks was never identified because the architecture itself remained secret. The families who created and maintained these systems formed an informal network. They used the same architects, the same specialized contractors, the same discrete modification services. Information about who had these capabilities and how to implement them circulated among them. This created a shared infrastructure of control among New York's wealthiest families. They could potentially monitor each other, gather intelligence on social rivals, track their own family members, observe guests, and maintain information asymmetries with business competitors. All of this occurred invisibly, protected by architectural concealment and financial discretion. The system's most powerful feature was its secrecy. Most people who lived or visited these mansions never suspected the hidden architecture existed. They made decisions, had conversations, and behaved normally, not realizing they might be under observation. This created perfect conditions for information gathering. People are most revealing when they think they're private. The hidden architecture made privacy an illusion, while leaving people with the false sense of security privacy should provide. And the system was self-protecting. Anyone who discovered it faced a dilemma. Who do you tell? The authorities? But the people controlling these mansions were often the authorities, or controlled them. Other servants? They had no power to address it. Family members? You'd be dismissed immediately, with no references, unemployable in any respectable house. So silence was rational. Margaret Sullivan lost her position simply for noticing the architecture. Others learned to ignore what they couldn't safely acknowledge. The few records that survived did so accidentally. Brennan's diary should have been destroyed. Hunt's fragmentary plans should never have been archived. Scattered mentions in letters and memoirs slipped past executors who might have suppressed them. From these fragments, we can reconstruct the system, but we can't fully reconstruct its uses. The families who commissioned this architecture left no documentation of what they did with these capabilities. The purposes remain officially unknown, but architecture reveals intention. You don't build sophisticated surveillance and access systems unless you intend to use them. You don't maintain and expand them over decades unless they're providing value. And you don't invest enormous effort in keeping them secret unless what you're doing requires secrecy. The mansions were machines. They didn't just house the wealthy. They enabled specific forms of power, observation access, information asymmetry, plausible deniability. They converted architectural space into social control. And they did it invisibly, because systems don't suffer. People do. The people who lived under observation without knowing it. The people whose privacy was systematically violated. The people whose secure spaces were secretly accessible. The servants dismissed for noticing too much. The system extracted value from architectural secrets, while ensuring those who paid the price never understood what was being done to them. Catherine Morrison was 17 when she realized the wall was watching her. She worked as a lady's maid in a Newport mansion during the summer season of 1894. Her employer, Mrs. Harriet Coleman, was exacting but generally fair. Catherine's duties included maintaining Mrs. Coleman's wardrobe, arranging her hair, and attending her during dressing. These activities occurred in Mrs. Coleman's private dressing room, a space Catherine had come to know intimately over 6 months of service. Every detail was familiar: the arrangement of perfume bottles on the vanity, the placement of the full-length mirrors, the pattern of roses in the wallpaper. Which is why she noticed when one of the roses was slightly discolored, not faded, darker, as though touched repeatedly by oily fingers. The spot was at exactly eye level, positioned in the section of wall behind where Mrs. Coleman sat during her toilette. Catherine moved closer. The wallpaper pattern was complex, but this particular rose had a small dark center that seemed different from the others. She pressed lightly against it. Something gave way. Not much, a fraction of an inch, but enough to feel the movement. She pulled her hand back, heart racing. That evening, after Mrs. Coleman had retired and Catherine was alone in the dressing room to prepare it for morning, she examined the spot more carefully. Using a hairpin, she carefully probed the dark center of the rose. The center was a hole, perfectly round, perhaps a 1/4 inch in diameter, and beyond it, darkness and the faint movement of air. Someone could look through that hole and observe everything that happened in this room. Every moment of Mrs. Coleman's private routine, every conversation Catherine had with her employer, every instance of undressing, bathing, the intimate rituals of a woman's private chamber. Catherine stepped back, scanning the walls with new eyes. How many other observation points existed? Were there more in other rooms? She said nothing. What could she say? To whom? Mrs. Coleman might be the one being observed, or she might be the one who knew about the hole and approved it, or someone else in the family might be watching. Catherine had no way to know. So she continued her duties, now aware that privacy in this house was an illusion, that intimate moments she'd assumed were witnessed only by herself, and her employer might have an unseen third observer. The awareness changed everything. She became conscious of her movements in ways she'd never been before, how she stood, where she positioned herself, what she said during the moments she and Mrs. Coleman were supposedly alone. Every action now performed with the possibility of hidden observation, and she began noticing other things. Sounds in the walls, faint but definitely present. Footsteps that seemed to originate from impossible locations. Drafts of air coming from solid walls. The sensation, persistent and unshakable, of being watched. Other servants felt it too. She heard them whisper about it in the brief moments when they gathered in servants' quarters. The house felt wrong, they said, like it had eyes, like the walls themselves were observing. But no one spoke about it openly. The senior servants, the housekeeper, the butler, maintained rigid silence on the subject. Any servant who raised questions was quietly dismissed within days. The psychological effect was erosive. Catherine found herself unable to relax, even in supposedly private moments. The servants' quarters should have been safe, their own space, however, cramped. But how could she be certain there were no observation points there? No hidden passages allowing access? She slept poorly, started at unexpected sounds, found herself constantly scanning walls for any sign of concealment. The house had become a trap, its every surface potentially concealing eyes. And the worst part was the uncertainty. She never saw direct evidence of active observation, never caught anyone emerging from a hidden passage, never found proof that the viewing port in Mrs. Coleman's dressing room was actually being used. But the architecture existed. The capability was real. Whether it was being actively exploited at any given moment didn't matter. The possibility was permanent, and the possibility itself was a form of control. Catherine lasted 8 months before she couldn't bear it anymore. She resigned, giving no specific reason. Mrs. Coleman wrote her a satisfactory reference, perhaps relieved to see her go. Servants who noticed too much were liabilities. Catherine found work in a smaller household, a family of more modest means, whose home was conventionally built. No hidden passages, no observation ports. Just a normal house where walls were solid and privacy meant something. But she never forgot the Newport mansion, never lost the habit of checking walls for irregularities, never quite shook the feeling that she might be watched at any moment. Multiply Catherine's experience by hundreds of servants across dozens of households, each one living in an environment of architectural surveillance they couldn't openly acknowledge, each one developing the same hypervigilance, the same erosion of any sense of genuine privacy. The psychological effect served a purpose. Servants who believed they might be watched at any time became more compliant. They self-regulated their behavior, never knowing which moments were actually observed, but unable to assume any moment was truly private. This is how panopticon architecture functions. The possibility of observation becomes more powerful than actual observation. You don't need to watch constantly. You just need people to believe they might be watched. The uncertainty itself enforces discipline. But the system affected more than servants. Family members, particularly women and children, lived in these houses too. They also occupied spaces potentially under surveillance. They also had bedrooms accessible through hidden panels, dressing rooms with viewing ports, private studies observable from secret passages. Diaries and letters from women in these households occasionally reference feelings of being watched. They use vague language, a sense of unease. The house feels oppressive. I have no peace even in my own chambers. They rarely make explicit accusations, perhaps because they had no proof, or perhaps because the implications were too disturbing to state directly. One particularly haunting entry comes from Mary Astor's private journal, written in 1889. I find myself unable to write freely, even here in my own room with the door locked. The walls seem thin. I have the persistent sensation that my privacy is not truly private. Perhaps I am imagining things. But the feeling does not fade, no matter how I reason against it. She was not imagining things. Her bedroom in the Fifth Avenue Astor Mansion contained multiple architectural features she didn't know about. A viewing port in the wall panel, a concealed door in her closet leading to the hidden passage system. Her locked door provided only the illusion of security. Whether anyone actively used these features to observe her is unknowable, but the architecture created the conditions for such observation, and the psychological effects were real regardless of actual use. Some women in these families developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of prolonged stress and anxiety. Insomnia, paranoia, obsessive checking of locks and windows, an inability to relax in their own homes. Their doctors diagnosed neurasthenia, hysteria, female nervousness, the fashionable diagnoses of the era. But perhaps these women weren't ill. Perhaps they were correctly perceiving their environment. They lived in houses that were architecturally designed to make privacy impossible, and their psychological responses were rational reactions to genuine violations of their security. Children experienced it differently, but no less disturbingly. Multiple memoirs from people who grew up in these houses mention nighttime fears that went beyond normal childhood anxieties. They heard sounds in the walls, adult footsteps, distant voices, movements that shouldn't have been possible. They insisted someone could enter their rooms even with doors locked. Their parents dismissed these as dreams or imagination. But the architecture suggests the children were right. Someone could enter their rooms. Someone could move through the walls. The sounds were real. One particularly chilling account comes from William Vanderbilt III, who wrote in his unpublished memoirs about his childhood in the 1890s. I insisted to my parents that people walked in the walls at night. I could hear them clearly. Footsteps, sometimes voices. My father said I was dreaming, but I know what I heard. And once, late at night, I saw a panel in my bedroom wall swing open for just a moment before closing again. A draft of cold air came through. I was too frightened to scream. In the morning, I looked for the panel but couldn't find any seam or opening. I told no one. He was perhaps 8 years old when this occurred. The experience stayed with him for life. These weren't isolated incidents. Across multiple households, spanning years, the pattern repeats. People living in these mansions experienced persistent feelings of being observed, of their privacy being violated, of the architecture itself being hostile to their sense of security. And they were correct. The houses were designed to make their inhabitants observable while concealing the means of observation. This created a permanent psychological state of uncertainty and vulnerability. For servants, this was intolerable but inescapable. They needed employment and had no power to demand different conditions. For family members, it was more complex. They theoretically had agency, but how do you address violations you can't prove? How do you complain about architecture that officially doesn't exist? So most people adapted. They learned to live with the unease. They developed coping mechanisms, checking rooms obsessively, creating privacy through behavioral rather than architectural means, accepting that true solitude was impossible in these spaces. This psychological adaptation itself was a form of damage, having to constantly monitor your own behavior because you might be observed at any moment, never being able to fully relax, living in a state of permanent low-level anxiety. The erosion was gradual enough that many didn't recognize it as abnormal. This was simply what life in a grand house felt like. The unease became normalized. The hypervigilance became habit. The absence of genuine privacy became accepted as the price of wealth. But some people couldn't adapt. They broke under the pressure of living in spaces that violated their fundamental sense of security. Emma Rhinelander was committed to a sanatorium in 1892 after what her family described as a nervous collapse. Her private letters, preserved by accident, reveal she'd become convinced someone was entering her bedroom at night. She would lock the door and wedge chairs against it, but items would still be moved. A book displaced, jewelry rearranged. She developed insomnia from fear. Her family thought she was delusional. But her bedroom in the Rhinelander mansion at 867 Fifth Avenue was the same one where Thomas Brennan had installed silent access from passage, exit through closet panel in 1890. Emma wasn't delusional. Someone could enter her room. They just used a route she didn't know existed. She never recovered. She remained in the sanatorium until her death in 1897, diagnosed with hysteria and paranoia. Her fears were dismissed as mental illness. The architecture that validated those fears remained secret. How many others experienced similar gaslighting? How many people were told their correct perceptions were delusions? How many were medicated, confined, or socially dismissed for noticing violations that were architecturally real but officially deniable. The hidden architecture didn't just enable physical surveillance. It enabled a form of psychological torture, making people feel observed while giving them no way to prove or prevent the observation, violating their privacy while maintaining the fiction that their privacy was intact, creating conditions that would drive anyone to distress, then dismissing that distress as mental weakness. And all of it was deliberate. The families who commissioned this architecture knew what they were creating. They specified the viewing ports, the silent mechanisms, the bedroom access points. They paid premium rates to ensure construction remained undocumented. They maintained and expanded the systems over years. They built environments that made the people living in them psychologically vulnerable, then exploited that vulnerability while denying it existed. The servants who developed hypervigilance, the wives who couldn't sleep in their own bedrooms, the children who knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what, the family members committed to sanatoria for correctly perceiving architectural violations. None of this was accidental collateral damage. It was the system working as designed. The architecture created power through information asymmetry and psychological control. Those who knew about the hidden systems could observe, access, and move freely while maintaining plausible deniability. Those who didn't know lived in a state of permanent uncertainty and vulnerability. And that uncertainty was permanent. You could never verify you weren't being watched, could never be certain your private spaces were actually private, could never relax completely, because the possibility of observation was always present. This is what life in these mansions actually felt like for many people who inhabited them. Not the luxury and elegance shown in photographs, but a persistent unease, a violation of the basic human need for privacy, an architecture that treated its occupants as subjects of surveillance rather than autonomous individuals. And this was called ordinary life. The photograph taken at Mrs. Astor's ball in 1896 shows 400 guests in perfect finery, women in elaborate gowns, jewels worth small fortunes, men in white tie and tails. The ballroom gleams, crystal chandeliers, polished marble, gilded details catching the light. Everyone is smiling. The image radiates wealth, culture, social triumph. This is what these families wanted recorded. This is what they wanted remembered. But consider what's absent from the photograph. The 30 servants working in the basement kitchens during the ball, preparing food in temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. The maids who spent 16 hours arranging the flowers, setting the tables, and would spend another 8 hours cleaning after guests departed. The footmen standing motionless for hours, trained to be functionally invisible. And the hidden architecture that surrounded this spectacle. The viewing ports potentially allowing observation of guests in private moments. The secret passages enabling movement through the house without using public corridors. The architectural capabilities that made privacy an illusion even in this supposedly controlled social space. The photograph shows celebration, but it was surrounded by systems of labor extraction and spatial control that the image carefully excludes. This contradiction defined the Gilded Age mansion. Spectacular public presentation concealing elaborate hidden mechanisms of control. The families who built these houses invested enormous resources in both aspects. The visible mansion required the finest materials, imported marble, custom woodwork, crystal from Europe, art from established masters. This was the display, the social performance, the architectural declaration of status. But they invested equally in the invisible architecture, the hidden passages, the viewing ports, the specialist contractors, the nighttime modifications, the systematic concealment from official documentation. Both aspects were essential. The public mansion created the image of refined civilization. The hidden architecture maintained the control that made the public image possible, and the two aspects remained rigidly separated. Guests at balls never saw the servants' quarters, where workers collapsed from exhaustion. Family members who commissioned observation points never acknowledged them in social conversation. The architects who designed dual structures never filed complete plans. This separation was maintained through spatial organization. The mansion itself enforced the boundary between visible and hidden. You could spend years in these houses as servant or family member and never fully understand their complete architecture. But the contradictions occasionally became visible. In 1892, a gas explosion in the basement of a Fifth Avenue mansion killed 3 servants. The investigation revealed the basement extended further than the filed architectural plans indicated. Officials attempting to assess the damage couldn't reconcile the building's physical layout with its documentation. The family claimed construction irregularities. Builders had deviated from approved plans. The investigation was quietly concluded without full resolution. The basement was rebuilt according to original specifications, which somehow no longer existed in complete form. The incident revealed what everyone had tacitly understood. These buildings' actual construction didn't match their official documentation. But the revelation led to no broader investigation, no requirement that families produce accurate plans. The wealthy controlled the regulatory mechanisms that might have enforced architectural transparency. Other cracks appeared in the facade. Servants occasionally rebelled against the conditions they worked under. In 1894, a group of maids in a Newport mansion collectively resigned, citing intolerable working conditions and violations of privacy. They didn't specify what violations, and the story was quickly suppressed. But the incident suggested servants were becoming aware of and resistant to the hidden surveillance. Some family members also reached breaking points. The divorce proceedings mentioned earlier sometimes included references to systematic violations of privacy within marriages. Wives who claimed their husbands observed them through hidden means. Husbands who accused wives of accessing private spaces impossibly. These cases were settled quietly. The architectural evidence was never introduced formally, but the accusations were specific enough to suggest real knowledge of the hidden systems. And occasionally, outsiders glimpsed the contradictions. Jacob Riis, the journalist who documented slum conditions, was invited to photograph a Fifth Avenue mansion for Society magazine in 1897. He wrote later that he found the experience profoundly disturbing, though he struggled to articulate why. The house was magnificent, yet oppressive. I had photographed tenements where 8 families shared space smaller than this mansion's ballroom. The contrast was obscene, but more than that, something about the house felt wrong. The servants moved like ghosts. The walls seemed to have layers I couldn't see. I was relieved to leave. Riis had photographed poverty extensively. He was familiar with harsh conditions, yet the mansion disturbed him in ways the slums hadn't. He was perceiving the hidden architecture's effects, even if he couldn't identify the mechanisms. The consequences of this system accumulated over time. For servants, the long-term effects were psychological. Those who worked in these environments developed lasting impacts: hypervigilance, inability to trust privacy, persistent anxiety about observation. Many carried these effects even after leaving service. Catherine Morrison, the lady's maid mentioned earlier, wrote a letter to her sister in 1910, 16 years after leaving the Newport mansion. "I still cannot shake the feeling of being watched. I know it's irrational. I live in a normal house now, work for a family of modest means. But I find myself checking walls for holes, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. What those years in that house did to me cannot be undone." For family members, particularly women, the effects were similar. Many developed chronic anxiety. Some, like Emma Rhinelander, suffered complete breakdowns. Others learned to live with constant unease, accepting it as normal. The children who grew up in these houses sometimes carried the damage into adulthood. William Vanderbilt III, who heard footsteps in the walls as a child, never fully trusted architectural privacy. His own home, built in the 1920s, had no hidden passages. He made certain of that. but he reportedly checked his children's bedrooms every night, ensuring no unexpected panels or openings existed. The system also had broader social consequences. The families who controlled this architecture formed networks. They shared information about who was building hidden systems, which contractors were reliable, which techniques worked best. This created an informal architecture of power, a group of families with enhanced capabilities for observation and information gathering. This provided advantages in social, political, and business contexts. If you could observe private conversations in your home, you could gather intelligence on guests. If you could access supposedly secure documents, you could acquire business advantages. If you could monitor family members, you could control information and behavior. These advantages compounded over time. Families with hidden architectural capabilities accumulated more wealth and power than those without. The systems became mechanisms for maintaining and expanding elite control across generations. But the systems also created vulnerabilities. What happens when multiple parties have observation capabilities? When both spouses in a marriage can potentially observe each other through hidden means? When parents can watch adult children, and adult children eventually discover the same systems? This created a condition of mutual assured surveillance, everyone potentially watching everyone else. Trust became impossible. Family relationships occurred under the permanent shadow of possible observation. Some families destroyed themselves through this dynamic. Children who discovered they'd been observed throughout childhood developed lasting resentments. Marriages collapsed under the weight of systematic mutual surveillance. Business partnerships dissolved when partners realized they'd been spied on in supposedly private discussions. The architectural systems designed to provide control sometimes generated the opposite: paranoia, dysfunction, and collapse of the very relationships they were meant to manage. And as time passed, the systems became liabilities in other ways. By the early 20th century, social attitudes were shifting. The rigid hierarchies of the Gilded Age were facing challenges. Labor organization was growing. Women were demanding rights. Progressive reforms were targeting extreme wealth inequality. The hidden architecture became dangerous to acknowledge. It represented exactly the kind of elite excess and control that reformers criticized. If the public learned that wealthy families had built surveillance systems into their homes, had systematically violated privacy, had created architectural mechanisms for monitoring servants and family members, the scandal would be enormous. So the silence deepened. The families became even more determined to ensure the systems remained hidden. Documents were destroyed. Contractors who knew too much were paid off or disappeared from records. Architectural plans were lost or edited. When mansions were demolished, as many were in the early 20th century, the work was done quickly and completely. No detailed architectural surveys were performed. The buildings were reduced to rubble before anyone could fully document their hidden features. This was not coincidental. The families wanted the evidence destroyed. The systems had become embarrassments, potential scandals that could damage social position. By mid-century, most of the grand mansions were gone, replaced by apartment buildings, hotels, or commercial structures. The hidden architecture was destroyed along with the buildings that contained it. A few mansions survived and became museums or cultural institutions. But even these underwent renovations before opening to the public. Hidden passages were sealed. Viewing ports were plastered over. The systems were erased, leaving only the public architecture, the beautiful facade that was always meant to be seen. The contradiction was resolved by eliminating one side of it. The hidden architecture was destroyed or concealed. The public memory retained only the visible mansion, the balls, the elegance, the cultural achievement. History remembers the beauty, not the cost, not the servants whose privacy was systematically violated, not the wives whose bedrooms were secretly observable, not the children who lived with footsteps in the walls, not the people committed to sanatoria for correctly perceiving architectural violations, and especially not the system itself, the elaborate hidden architecture of control, observation, and spatial domination that wealthy families built into their homes and then systematically erased from the historical record. Return to that corridor that shouldn't exist. The walls are still papered in silk, still expensive, still 3 feet wide, forcing you to move with shoulders angled, head slightly bowed. It's dark, no windows, minimal light. The air is still, undisturbed by normal household circulation. You're standing in a space that was built deliberately, but documented never. A passage constructed at substantial expense and then concealed from official knowledge, an architectural feature that exists in physical reality, but was systematically excluded from the mansion's public identity. And you're not alone in here. If you move through this passage, following its turns through the wall cavities, you'll find the viewing ports. Small openings, precisely positioned. Put your eye to one and you see into a library, the desk, the chairs, the fireplace. Everything visible. The person in that library has no idea they're observable from this position. Move further and you'll find the concealed doors. Press the right spot and a panel swings open into a bedroom. No lock on this side. Silent hinges. You could enter that bedroom while its occupant sleeps, and they would never know unless you wanted them to. The architecture gave someone these capabilities: access, observation, information, asymmetry, power derived from spatial control and hidden knowledge. But who used these passages? When? For what purposes? The families who commissioned this architecture left no documentation. The contractors who built it took their knowledge to their graves. The servants who noticed it learned to stay silent. The mansion itself conceals its secrets behind layers of wall panel and architectural misdirection. We have evidence that these systems existed: the fragmentary plans, the contractor's diary, the servants' observations, the unexplained spatial discrepancies. We can reconstruct how they functioned architecturally, but we cannot fully reconstruct how they were used. The purposes remain deliberately obscured, yet architecture reveals intention. You don't build sophisticated surveillance and access systems without planning to use them. You don't maintain and expand them over decades unless they're providing value. You don't invest enormous effort in concealing them unless what you're doing requires secrecy. The capabilities existed. The opportunities existed. The investment was substantial and sustained. Logic suggests the systems were actively exploited. But for what? Monitoring servants seems too simple. Open supervision could accomplish that without hidden architecture. The viewing ports and bedroom access points suggest purposes beyond household management. Gathering intelligence on guests, maintaining control over family members, facilitating activities that required plausible deniability about who was where, when. The architecture permitted all of these. We just don't have records of what actually occurred within it. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the most important feature of the system was its ability to enable actions while preventing documentation, to create capabilities while maintaining deniability, to build power through architecture while ensuring no evidence survived of how that power was exercised. The hidden passages allowed things to happen that left no trace. The viewing ports enabled observations that couldn't be proven. The concealed doors permitted access that could be denied. This is sophisticated control. Not just the ability to act, but the ability to act invisibly, with no accountability, no verification, no way for those affected to prove what was done to them. Catherine Morrison felt observed, but couldn't prove it. Emma Rhinelander knew someone entered her bedroom, but couldn't demonstrate how. Mary Astor sensed violations of her privacy, but had no evidence. The architecture was designed to create exactly this condition: real violations that remained unprovable, real capabilities that stayed hidden, real power that operated without accountability. And when we remember these mansions today, when we tour the few that survive, when we admire photographs of Gilded Age balls, when we feel nostalgia for what seems like a more elegant era, We're remembering the public architecture, the beautiful facade, the visible mansion. We're not remembering the hidden passages where someone could walk through the walls, the viewing ports where private moments were potentially observed without consent, the concealed doors where locked rooms weren't actually secure. We're remembering the image the families wanted to project, not the systems they built to maintain control over the people who lived in and visited these buildings. This erasure was deliberate. The families destroyed documentation. They sealed passages when mansions became museums. They ensured their descendants learned the public family history, the business success, the cultural contributions, the social prominence, but not the architectural capabilities their ancestors commissioned. The surviving members of these families likely don't know their great-grandparents built observation systems into their homes. That knowledge died with the generation that created it. The secrets stayed secret, but the physical evidence remains, however fragmentary. The slight discrepancies in blueprints, the unexplained spatial gaps, the architectural features that make no sense unless understood as surveillance infrastructure. And once you know what to look for, you start seeing the pattern everywhere, not just in Gilded Age mansions. The principle, using architecture to enable observation and control while concealing the mechanisms, appears throughout history and continues into the present. Different technologies, different techniques, but the same basic strategy. Build capabilities into physical space, then obscure those capabilities from the people being affected by them. Modern surveillance is more obvious in some ways. Cameras, sensors, digital monitoring, but it's also more concealed in others. You don't know which cameras are active or who's watching. You don't know what data is being collected or how it's being used. The systems are more sophisticated, but no more visible to those being monitored. The Victorian mansion's hidden passages were low-tech versions of the same principle, using physical architecture to create information asymmetry, building the capability to observe without being observed, maintaining control through concealment. The families who commissioned these systems understood something fundamental about power. It operates most effectively when its mechanisms remain invisible. When people modify their behavior because they might be watched, not because they know they are. When violations of privacy occur without provable evidence. When those affected can't even articulate what's being done to them because the systems remain officially unacknowledged. This is why the passages stayed hidden, why the documentation was destroyed, why the families enforced such rigid silence. Not because they were ashamed, though perhaps they should have been, but because the system's effectiveness depended on secrecy. Once people understood the full extent of the hidden architecture, they could defend against it. Knowledge undermined the power the systems provided. So the families who benefited from this architecture had every incentive to ensure it remained concealed. And they had the resources to achieve that concealment, destroying documents, dismissing servants who noticed too much, sealing passages in buildings that became public. What survives is the beautiful image, the elegant rooms, the refined social life, the cultural achievements. The families are remembered for their public contributions, the libraries they funded, the museums they supported, the philanthropic works they performed. The architectural systems that enabled their power are mostly forgotten, erased from popular memory along with the buildings that contained them. But architectural truth persists, even when architectural evidence is destroyed. The spatial discrepancies remain in historical records. The contractor's diary survived. The servants' memories, fragmentary as they are, exist, and the logic is inescapable. These systems existed. They served purposes important enough to justify substantial investment and elaborate concealment. They gave certain people capabilities over others, observation, access, information gathering. Those capabilities were almost certainly used. The architecture wouldn't have been maintained and expanded if it provided no value, which means these mansions were sites of sustained violations of privacy, autonomy, and security for the people who lived in them. servants, family members, guests. Violations that were architecturally enabled, economically resourced, and legally protected by the power of those committing them, and then erased from memory when preservation of reputation required it. So, when we remember this world, when we admire the grand mansions of the Gilded Age, when we study the families who built them, when we tour the surviving buildings and feel nostalgia for a seemingly more elegant time, what are we actually remembering? Are we remembering the complete architecture? Or just the visible portions? Are we remembering the experiences of everyone who lived in these spaces? Or just those whose experiences were considered worth recording? Are we remembering historical truth? Or a carefully constructed image that conceals as much as it reveals? The hidden passages are mostly gone now, sealed behind new walls or destroyed entirely. But they were real. The viewing ports existed. The nighttime modifications happened. The contractor was paid in cash to build spaces that appeared on no official plans. Somewhere in the walls of a few surviving mansions, those passages might still exist, plastered over and forgotten. The architecture of secrets concealed beneath the architecture of beauty. And an understanding that these two architectures coexisted, that the elegant public spaces were surrounded by hidden systems of observation and control, we begin to understand what wealth actually required in this era. Not just money, but mechanisms of power that operated invisibly, systems that violated privacy while maintaining its appearance, architecture that made certain people perpetually vulnerable while ensuring they could never prove or prevent their violation. This is what the hidden passages reveal. Not just that wealthy families built secret spaces, but what those spaces were for, what they enabled, what they protected, what they erased. The mansions are gone, mostly. The families are gone entirely. The generation that built these systems and the generation that lived in them, all dead. But the evidence remains. Fragmentary, scattered, concealed in archives and architectural details. Enough to reconstruct the hidden architecture. Enough to understand what it enabled. Not enough to fully expose what was done within it. And perhaps that's the final achievement of these systems. Even now, over a century later, with all the participants dead and most of the buildings destroyed, the secrets are still protected. We can prove the architecture existed, we can document its capabilities, but we cannot fully reveal what actually occurred in those hidden passages. What was observed through those viewing ports? Who entered which rooms through the concealed doors? What violations occurred that left no evidence except the persistent unease of those who experienced them? The families who built these systems succeeded in protecting their secrets across time. The hidden architecture is known now, but its uses remain obscured. The truth survives only in fragments. A servant's letter, a child's memory, a wife's journal entry describing sensations she couldn't explain. Small pieces of larger violations that will never be fully documented. And the question remains, when we remember Victorian mansions, their beauty, their elegance, their cultural significance, whose experience are we truly remembering? The families who commissioned the public architecture and enjoyed its benefits? Or the servants, wives, and children who lived surrounded by hidden passages they weren't supposed to know existed? The people whose privacy was architecturally violated while those violations remained undocumented and deniable? Whose memories were dismissed as imagination or paranoia when they correctly perceived they were being observed and controlled through spatial means? The answer shapes how we understand not just Victorian architecture, but the nature of power itself. Because these mansions reveal what power looks like when it can afford to build its own infrastructure, when it can commission systems of control, then conceal them from official knowledge, when it can violate autonomy architecturally while maintaining deniability legally. The hidden passages aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of how power operates when it's wealthy enough to build invisibility into physical space. and there are warnings about what we might not be seeing in the architectures surrounding us now. The systems change, the technologies evolve, but the principle remains constant. Those with resources build capabilities others can't see. They use architecture, physical and digital, to observe, access, and control. And they ensure the mechanisms remain concealed, so their capabilities stay unknown to those being affected. The Victorian mansion's hidden passages are gone, but the logic that created them persists. And until we learn to see the invisible architectures of power, to recognize when spaces are designed to make us vulnerable while concealing the mechanisms of our vulnerability, we remain as unaware as the Victorian servants who walked past hidden viewing ports without knowing the walls were watching. So when we remember this world, whose life are we truly remembering?